Lily Landscaping is a commercial landscaping contractor located in the Chicago metro area. It is a successful business, but the company faces many new challenges due to business growth. These challenges include complex payroll calculations, workplace regulations, and inventory management. By creating a flexible database design, Lily Landscaping will be able to address current and future business needs. The most pressing problem that Lily Landscaping is facing is the work assignment and payroll system. In the past, the office manager completed payroll manually due to a small number of workers employed and simplicity of regulations they needed to meet. State-level mandates currently require Lily Landscaping to pay employees who are working on certain types of projects to be paid based on a union scale per hour rate that is based on the skill classification for the job that they are doing at any given time on a project. Payroll complexity is increased due to employees working on multiple job sites and in various skill classifications on any given day. Lily Landscaping currently hires about 25 workers, and the company intends to expand its operations even more, which will make payroll increasingly more difficult to calculate. The second problem that Lily Landscaping is facing are changes in the employment equity legislation. Currently, a report stating how many hours were worked by women and racial minorities for each qualifying project must be sent to the Equal Opportunity Commission every 2 weeks. The legislation requires 10% of all hours must be worked by a woman or a racial minority. Failure to comply with this standard would disqualify Lily Landscaping in bidding on any qualifying contracts, which now consists of 90% of Lily Landscaping's business. As previously stated, tracking employee site and skill assignments across Lily Landscaping's many projects is complex since employees work on multiple sites and within different skill assignments each day. Adequate tracking is needed to ensure that Lily Landscaping is tracking all hours worked on a site, which employees are working on that job site, the number of hours each individual employee works on that site, and appropriate demographics for each employee, so that Lily Landscaping can assess their current status on a project and make any necessary adjustments to employee assignments to stay compliant. The third problem that Lily Landscaping is facing is the inventory management. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, better known as OSHA, one of their inspectors fined the company for neglected equipment that could be potentially hazardous. The company owns a significant amount of material, small tools, vehicles, and heavy equipment. Now that business is booming, it becomes very difficult to track which job site inventory has been assigned to and the tracking of the maintenance on necessary pieces. This could lead to potentially disastrous consequences. Now that we've established the core business issues we would like to track with our system, let's talk about our core tables that will really anchor our database. The first will be project info, the second, employee info, and lastly, supplies. So let's break each of these down. So first we have our project info table, and what we'll have on that is a unique project ID so that we can track each and every individual project we have. It'll have a type ID, an assigned supervisor, a customer associated with it, what is the budget, what was the total cost, what was our profit, and the start and end date of each project. And then we want a separate table for all of the customer info. So they will have a unique ID. We'll track their name, if they're associated with the business, what is their customer type? Are they a government entity, a school district, a private business? And then we'll have their address, city, state, and zip. And then we need to assign a project type. So each project type will have an ID and it'll tell us the name. Again, is it a private business? Is it a district program? Is it a government entity? Because only certain types of projects will require a bid, so we want to track is a bid needed. And then we want to track that job site, address, city, state, and zip code. And then we want a following table that if it's been triggered by a project type ID that needs a bid, we want to be able to track the bidding process. So again, it'll flag with the type ID, and then we will link it to the site visit date. When is the review date that they go over the proposal? When did we submit the bid, and did we actually win it? So once we have all of that info for a project, then we need to look at our employees. So on the employee info table, we want to start with an employee ID, and in here we want to track social security number, name, address, phone number, email, race and gender so that we can populate the EEOC report, available hours, and their I-9 status, their W-4, and their skill classification IDs for skills that they have. And so first, to be able to assign skills, we first need to do skills classifications. What skills do we need to hire for? And so each skill will have an ID and it'll have a name, and if any certifications are needed to have that skill. And once we've paired an employee with certain skills, we're going to assign them, and that will be tied to their employee ID and a skills classification ID. And then if it did need a certification, we will have the date that the employee got that certification. And once we have all of that, we can now also assign employees to a project. So then we just do association table with project ID and employee ID, so we know that they're assigned. And then we need to start to do payroll things. So first and foremost, we need to start tracking their wages. And so here we'll have a wage ID for the project for them based on do we need to use the union pay scale or do we not need to? So we need to track that pay. What is the skill type, the hourly pay for that? How many hours did the employee work? What was their total pay out of that? And link it again to that employee ID and project ID. And then we can finally do payroll. And so payroll, we're going to start with a payroll ID. So that's like a check number, but again, direct deposit. So we just want an individual ID for each payroll that we run so we can track whether or not the employee received it. Again, attaching it to that employee ID. And then we need the wage ID because we know employees use multiple skills over a work session. So we want that wage ID. And then we will have the calculated total gross pay, what tax withholdings we need, what benefits withholdings we need to make, and then finally, what is that take-home pay amount? Now, after employee info, we move into the supplies. So the core of this is the supplies table, and each item will be assigned an ID number. And then we need to track, do we own it or rent it? How many do we have on hand? And then we want to be able to track project ID and supplier ID. And we want to track project ID because we need to know where items have been assigned to. So, how many hard hats did we send to a project? Our forklift, which site is that on? We need to know that. And we also need to know who supplied it. So then we go to our supplier table, and each supplier will have an ID number, and we'll have their contact name and then their address and all of that information, which then will be tied to the invoices as well. But back to supplies, we know that some supplies, we just need basic information like hard hats or hammers. But we know that vehicles and heavy equipment, we need to know a little bit more information about them. So we'll have their item IDs, and then for each individual vehicle or heavy equipment piece, we need to know for the vehicles, we need their VIN, their license plate, make, model, year, where do we have the vehicle registered, and what is our registration due date so we can keep on track with keeping our vehicles registered. And then for heavy equipment, just keeping that make, model, and year. And then once we know what all we have, we know we need to track invoices for each of these three areas. And so you'll see that we have supplies invoices, equipment invoices, and vehicle invoices. And that's because probably with supplies, we want to track payment type. So is this we're paying the whole thing, or is this an installment payment? Is this an auto loan? We want to be able to track that, and we know that's going to be different across the three. So you'll see that everyone needs an invoice number, who is the supplier for that vehicle, the item ID number, and then we have the amount paid, the due date, again, what kind of payment is it, and then how much was it. And then you'll see that same process for equipment and vehicle invoice. And then because of the OSHA standard that we violated at Lily Landscape, we want to make sure we're tracking maintenance. So for each maintenance request, we are going to have a log ID, and then we're going to link that to an item ID. And we need to know the employee who requested maintenance. We need to know the date that it was requested and the date that it's completed. And then we also assume we're going to have invoices related to maintenance. So again, we're going to track that invoice number, and then we want to link it back to the log ID because no maintenance can be invoiced unless we know who is requesting it and when. And then we'll track the amount paid, the due date. Again, what is that payment type? Are we paying in full or are we paying in installments? And then lastly is just tracking that full amount of the maintenance expenditure. Now that we have all of that, we also need to be able to keep track of expenses and make invoices ourselves. So we want to track the total amount of wages per project. And then we also want to keep track of our business expenditures that aren't necessarily related to projects, like office rent and things, business tax expenses and things like that. So we'll have an expenditure ID for the type of expenditure that it is in each individual one. And then we'll have a name for it, an amount, and the employee that cleared this expenditure. And then once we have all of this all together with all of our invoices for projects and things like that, we can come up with a total project cost. And that will be tied to the project ID, and that'll include wages. Is there any business expenditures, supplies expenditures, equipment, vehicles, maintenance? All of that should be tied to a project, and then we'll be able to finally issue a project invoice. So that's the basis of our database. We're excited to hear back from Lily Landscape on our proposal. Thank you for listening today.